All right, so as we are talking about argument and persuasion and all of that, we've talked about logical fallacies and how those can be kind of used to manipulate in a way and to try to persuade people, but obviously it's a flawed version, right? Because the logic in it is flawed. So it's very similar to propaganda. They're kind of related. And so we're going to talk about propaganda and how it is used in different instances and kind of give you an example to allow you to be able to identify it whenever you see it out in the real world. So I want you to think for a moment and, just to yourself, think about what is propaganda? What comes to your mind? What do you think entails propaganda? All of that. So can you think of any examples of propaganda that you may encounter daily? So before we talk about what exactly is propaganda, we're going to look at something that may or may not be an example of it. And so I want you to look and, just to yourself decide, is it an example of propaganda, and why is it or why not? So, and the next one, so I'm going to show you another one, is this next slide, an example of propaganda, why or why not? And also I want you to think about how is it different or how is it similar to the previous image that we looked at? Okay, we're going to look at one more. So is the following one an example of propaganda, why or why not? And how is it different or similar to the other two that we just looked at? So now that we've looked at those and you've kind of thought to yourself and just trying to come to a verdict on whether or not those are propaganda, what exactly is propaganda? So this is actually the definition of it. So propaganda is an organized program of publicity used to promote the acceptance or rejection of a belief, practice, person, people, or ideology. So with that in mind, we can ascertain that all three of those slides were actually propaganda. Some of them didn't seem very negative, right? So, that's one thing we're going to look at. It's not always negative, but it definitely has a negative connotation and is probably pretty often used negatively. So let's go back to this image. You've probably seen it before. There is a variation of it outside of the Arkansas Heart Hospital, if you have been by there. And this is Rosie the Riveter. And the slogan on there, "We can do it," says probably something that you have heard before. It's from 1942. So Rosie the Riveter is the character here. So this was a part of a U.S. propaganda poster, to represent American women going into the factories to work because the men were off at war during World War II. So the women had to take on the jobs because someone had to do it, right? This, and if you weren't aware, this is significant because prior to this point in time, women did not work. Women were at home. And it was very much kind of like the entryway or the doorway to women being in the workforce. All right, this next one, attitude. So this particular poster was from 85 to 90. Companies in general often use feel-good propaganda in support of aims such as team building or to try to convince workers to be more productive. So this is an instance, another instance where it's used, in a positive way, where you are trying to get people to feel a certain way, right? Because that's what the definition is. So you are doing that in a way that is, fruitful. Now here's another one, Poisoning the Well. This is a editorial cartoon from 2011. Editorial cartoons are another form of communication that relies heavily on propaganda techniques. So consider the indictment of the media. So think about what they're actually saying here. So here are, just kind of sum it up for you, the characteristics of propaganda. Propaganda tries to get you to believe in an idea or to feel a certain way. Propaganda is not always done for bad purposes. And it attempts to convince you by manipulating your emotions rather than making a logical argument. So you might have been wondering, well, what's the difference between that and persuasion? So that last point is the key piece, because in all the other, persuasive, techniques, all that we've talked about, like Tolman and all that, you need to have the logos part, right? You need to have the evidence. So with propaganda, it's just completely relying on your emotions. That's sensationalism. So what I want you to do is, in just a moment, pause this video, open up the propaganda techniques handout that I have posted for you. And then what I want you to do is go through and just read about each of those different types of techniques that are used in propaganda. And then we will see in just a moment, after you unpause me on here, you'll be able to see those different techniques actually at play in different pieces of propaganda that we'll look at. All right, so after you have gone through and read all the propaganda techniques, so let's look at these next 9 slides and look at what kind of techniques do you see being used in these. So we can do it one. So we're back to this. The propaganda techniques, as you can see on the bottom, hero narrative, bandwagon, nationalism, symbols, and imagery. Okay, the next one with the attitude one, hero narrative. So the workers are told that they can make a big difference. And then also symbols and imagery. The next one, Poisoning the Well. So you see a couple of these different ones here, name calling, scare tactics, symbols and imagery. The next one is called careless talk. So these are the ones that we haven't looked at yet. So you might have heard this before, or you might have heard the terms loose lips sink ships. So between Canada and Britain and the US, those were pretty common, slogans and posters and all that during the war. So this one is particularly from 40 to 41, and it's a Canadian World War II poster. And it's reminding people about, talking about military things and war things, because you never know what spies are out there, what spies are there listening. So if you have seen Wonder Woman, my favorite, then, when they are in, I don't remember if they're in London, but they're in England, and they are referring to this about, having spies there listening. So the propaganda techniques here are nationalism, othering, and scare tactics. The next one is discriminate against. So this is from 1900. Propaganda can serve multiple related purposes. So for example, this poster pushes for labor rights while also being an advertisement for union-made fabrics. So the techniques used in this are bandwagon, And you can see it by like endorsed by all trade unions. And loaded language, like using the term sweatshop. And symbolism, using the union label. The next one, Ethos Water. So this started in 2001 and it's still going on. You're probably familiar with it, or the brand at least. So sometimes the product is the propaganda. So with Ethos, the water is sold with the promise that some of the money from the purchase of each bottle will go towards giving clean drinking water to communities in Africa. So the propaganda techniques, hero narrative, got Matt Damon, and he says every bottle makes a difference. There's also misinformation. So it's only a tiny percentage of the purchase price goes to charity. So that is something that you need to be aware of. For example, October being Breast Cancer Awareness Month. And, a lot of companies will do, Think Pink or, buy these different things and we'll donate whatever to breast cancer awareness or breast cancer research, blah, blah, blah. So sometimes they are just doing like a Think Pink kind of thing, but they're not actually donating anything. So you actually have to look to see if they actually say they are, because they might just make you assume that they are. But also it might be like they're donating like 5% of proceeds, which is, very small. So that's one thing you have to pay attention to. So this next one is Snowbirds Don't Fly. It is from 1971. It's a DC comic. Comic books are a pretty popular vehicle for propaganda of all different kinds. So like this one, it's an anti-drug issue of the Green Lantern and Green Arrow. And the techniques being used here are hero narrative, loaded language, like using the term junkie, and scare tactics. Next one, global warming. This one's from 1996. And it's from the Heartland Institute. And they said that propaganda, or it's their piece of propaganda, and the propaganda has a multifaceted relationship with science. Occasionally it can base its claims on statements made by science, while other times it will refute any kind of scientific evidence without even backing up its claims. So it's just kind of a love-hate relationship depending on when it serves them. Or people that tend to kind of go back and forth with science related things. So we've got this image here. So the techniques being used are misinformation. So for example, it's stating facts, like ideas that contradict the conclusions of what most climate scientists actually say. It also has denialism. So, like no current harms, or using the terms warmer is better. Or loaded language, like using heartland, because it makes it feel like, feel good kind of thing. Or it's, supporting the country, or, wholesome, that kind of thing. Also, it uses pseudoscience, uses symbols and imagery. So like the image of the kid who's barefoot, it's kind of associated with, good memories, in the summer, right? And also it suggests that global warming will make it summer all the time. So as you probably already know, and what we have touched on, there is also hateful propaganda, right? And that's probably what most people typically think of when they think of propaganda. So the following slides that we are going to look at are examples of hateful propaganda. So as you go through each slide, I want you to think about these questions. The first is, how do the more openly hateful sites use propaganda differently than those that attempt to conceal their hateful message? So kind of look at like the different techniques that they use, because some of them are a little bit more subtle than others. Also, why do hate groups rely on propaganda to get their message across? And just kind of a hint, among other reasons, because they actually don't have a legitimate argument to make. They can only convince you by manipulating your emotions, which is what propaganda does. Remember, it's only emotion-based. It has nothing to do with logic. The next question is, how do cloaked hate sites use propaganda techniques to hide their true nature? So, my hint for you, among other things, they use them to make themselves seem more legit and authoritative and to get their message across without saying it outright. So, a wee bit shady, right? All right, so the first one, it's called The New Battle for Britain. It's from 2009. It is by the British National Party. Political campaigns rely heavily on propaganda techniques to drum up support for their parties and ideologies. The British National Party, a fringe party known for its extreme anti-immigrant platform, is a classic example. So let's just look at the different pieces of that. So the techniques that they are using are hero narrative. So, using the terms the new battle for Britain. Misinformation. So they are trying to link immigration and unemployment in their poster or flyer or whatever it is. But they aren't actually linked, but they are portraying it as there is a link. Also, there's loaded language like the terms ripoff and common sense. Mainstreaming, nationalism, othering, and symbols and imagery. The next one, the Facebook page for Thomas Jefferson, American. This is one of the many Facebook pages created in the name of famous Americans by the National Policy Institute. These are examples of cloaked hate sites. So these are sites which pretend to be sources of legitimate information, but they actually link back to organizations posting hateful material. So sometimes you have to look to see who is actually running this information that looks legitimate. So where is this information coming from? Remember, that is one of the things that you look at when you're looking at sources, right? When we talked about that. So the propaganda techniques here: hero narrative, loaded language, mainstreaming, bandwagon, nationalism, symbols, and imagery. The next one, the Canadian Immigration Report. So this website hides its racism claims that it is providing an unbiased examination of the, quote, impact of immigration on Canada and Canadians. But if you look closer at it, you'll see articles with titles such as, quote, the ignorant tolerance of the West towards Islam, and, quote, multiculturalism breeds hate crime. So, it makes it pretty evident there. The propaganda techniques they use, misinformation. So they only have negative stories about immigration. Like there's nothing positive. They only want to show, one side or manipulate the information to suit their purpose, right? Jane Goodall, her views are misrepresented. And loaded language, like the term hitman, nationalism, scare tactics, symbols, and imagery. The next one, the Committee for Open Debate on the Holocaust. So this site claims to be an open, quote, debate on the topic of the Holocaust, but it's actually the only purpose of this site is to deny that the Holocaust even happened. So the propaganda techniques that they use are hero narrative. It portrays itself as, quote, breaking the power of taboo, misinformation, denialism, loaded language, name calling, symbols and imagery, like the broken handcuffs. The next one, National Vanguard. So this site is pretty open about its hateful message, but uses a variety of propaganda techniques to kind of skew them and manipulate them to make them seem positive and reasonable. So the techniques that they use are misinformation, loaded language, pseudoscience, nationalism, othering, scare tactics like racial violence in America, symbols and imagery.